Welcome, everybody, to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are looking at Portugal and the age of exploration, really zoning in on them and their role and their accomplishments. So, any discussion of this is incomplete without a discussion of Prince Henry the Navigator. Now, Prince Henry of Portugal was inspired by Marco Polo and his trips from Venice, Italy, all the way out into China and back. Now, with this inspiration, learning about the region from the tales of Marco Polo, he gathered together sailors, shipwrights, and astronomers to study navigation to see how Portugal might be able to reach the east. Now, the end result of this study was the caravel, which was the most advanced ship of its time. With the caravel, the Portuguese will dominate ocean travel. Their first step in this exploratory phase of Portuguese empire was to travel along the west coast of Africa. Now, Portugal and other European nations really had no idea how big Africa was. Africa is big. It is not a small place. Now, at the time, many believed that it was probably about the size of Europe. They were aware of the Sahara Desert, believed that it pretty much was the Sahara Desert and North Africa. Europeans believed that Africa was mostly empty. Instead, as they traveled around Africa, they discovered that it was huge and that it had its own developed civilizations south of the Sahara Desert. To quickly review those civilizations, we have Ghana. Now, Ghana existed long before Portuguese exploration, and the Portuguese had no contact with the Empire of Ghana. This empire, right here, began as a center of trade with North African Muslims. Mali, its successor empire, comes to dominate West Africa during this time frame that we're talking, the late time frame, from 1200 to about 1500 CE. Now, Mali was an Islamic kingdom, having adopted Islam from its contact with North African traders, and it was governed from its capital city of Timbuktu. Now, the Portuguese were aware of Mali, came in contact with them, and traded with the Mali. But they also encouraged the Mali to wage war against their neighbors, including the Songhai, because that war would increase Mali's access to particular goods, in particular slaves, which were just starting to be traded in larger numbers. Now, Songhai will eventually win those conflicts against Mali. And from 1493 to 1528, Songhai expands and takes over the Empire of Mali, and they become the dominant force in the region. Now, when Songhai rises up and replaces Mali, they then become the chief trading partner of the Portuguese in West Africa. And slaves, as a result of this conflict with Mali, increase in the region, right? You capture the people of your rival empire, you have the option of enslaving them, as the Empire of Songhai did, enslaving many of the Mali and of other people in the region. And that became a major trade item beginning in the early mid-1500s. Now, Songhai will eventually be defeated. They'll be overthrown by a North African army as they come into the region. And that disrupts West African power, but it does not change the nature of the trade relationships with the Portuguese. And the Portuguese do get rich doing this. They get very wealthy with this West African trade. In fact, they named this region after their trade items. The three main trade items that the Portuguese got access to along the southern coast of West Africa. They named a region the Gold Coast for the amount of gold that was traded out of the region. The Ivory Coast, this nation still has that name. Okay, the Ivory Coast is still a West African name, having its roots the West African nation having its roots in Portuguese trade. The third one was the slave coast, where many of these slaves were bought and shipped out of West Africa. Now, the sale of African slaves eventually becomes one of the most profitable items traded out of West Africa. It begins with the Portuguese, others then take over this trade. Now, this was not the main goal of the Portuguese. The main goal of the Portuguese was always to reach the Indian Ocean, but that required years and years of pushing further and closer to the tip of Africa to figure out exactly how far south it went. And in 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz is the first Portuguese navigator to reach the southern tip of Africa. Upon reaching it, he named that southern tip the Cape of Good Hope, a name that it still has today, because he realized that they had crossed the southern tip of Africa, they had left the Atlantic Ocean, and now were in the Indian Ocean. This voyage was possible, but it would not be Bartolomeu Diaz who does it. Instead, it will be the next voyager to come along, 1497, Vasco da Gama, who now has the mission of actually sailing into the Indian Ocean, reaching India, and then returning back to Portugal, which he does, which kicks off the Portuguese domination of the Indian Ocean trade, introducing the caravel, that new element, into the Indian Ocean, and from the caravel comes Portuguese domination. All right, so that was it for today. I hope you learned something in today's lesson, and I will see you next time. Farewell.